Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gil Epen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gil@epen.info. My guest today is Matthias Doepke, who is a research professor in the Department of Economics at Northwestern University. His research spans many areas, including parenting, inequality, and their economic effects on society. Welcome, Matthias.
Thanks for having me.
Sure, yeah. So I want to start with one of your recent books entitled Love, Money, and Parenting: How Economics Explains the Way We Raise Our Kids. And the book uses the tools of economics to understand why and how child rearing practices vary so much over time and across societies. You argue and document with data analysis that the growth of intensive parenting, such as helicopter parenting, tiger moms, etc., is not just a new fashion, but it's a response of loving parents to a trend of growing of income inequality. It's an odd connection. So you want to talk a bit about the hypothesis and the data that you used and what conclusions you reached?
Yes, I would love to. So this trend in parenting that we're talking about is documented in many different places. You can see it in time use data, for example, where you see that in the 1970s, most parents were relatively relaxed. They watched over their kids, made sure they came home at night, but it wasn't really the same intensity as now. Whereas now you see many news stories about helicopter parents, about snowplow parents. It's a new type of parent every week, where parents are super engaged, also sign up their kids for many activities, are there to make sure everything goes right. So they have a lot more effort. We can see in the time use that just the time that parents spend interacting with their children has grown enormously. And it also comes with a heightened anxiety and this perception of pressure.
Right.
And one reason we wanted to address this is that this is something that also really happened in our own lives. So my co-author Fabrizio Dilibotti is Italian. He grew up in northern Italy in the 70s. I'm German, grew up in Germany. And our own childhoods were very much like this more relaxed, permissive example. So my own parents, they gave us food. They made sure we but that was it.
Yeah.
For example, homework is something that was for kids. My parents would never have thought about checking our homework or sitting there helping us with those tasks. Whereas now that's quite different. And after school, school was over like at 1 p.m. and from essentially lunch until nightfall, we could do what we want and play soccer, go to friends. Our parents wouldn't know where we are. It's just your own life, your own independent childhood. And that was actually a very fun way to grow up. So we enjoyed that. And so we were kind of expecting, I think, that we would be very similar in our own parenting choices later on. And now we arrive here, 40 years later, and it turns out that in our own parenting, we turn out to be a lot more like other parents now are. So we are more intense. We do pay more attention. We make sure the homework gets done. We sign them up for activities. We have turned into something like a helicopter parent ourselves. And that's, of course, a bit of a personal surprise. Now, what should you make of this? If you read the newspapers on this stuff, it is often this notion that somehow parents have lost the right way, that there's something wrong with parenting, that we have kind of gotten too concerned, and that if parents could only relax, then maybe we could get to a better outcome and more relaxed childhood. But this view that parents are doing it wrong, this is really what conflicts with our professional views as economists. And this is where the economics comes in, because economics is a social science. Social sciences want to understand how people make decisions, and the usual approach that economists take is to start from the assumption, from the view that people more or less know what they are doing, that they're pursuing certain objectives, that their behavior can be understood as a broadly rational, a broadly purposeful reaction to the environment that they face, the incentives that are provided by their environment. So this economic perspective would suggest, well, there's a reason why behavior has changed.
Okay, so you observe there's differences across countries and perhaps across time as well in specific countries. And you're hypothesizing that there has to be something that is driving it.
Exactly.
So one of the factors you're looking at, I'm looking at the chart you have in your article. You have sort of a correlation drawn between income inequality, which is on the x-axis, and sort of the parents praising hard work of students on the y-axis. And we have different countries here, Sweden all the way to the bottom left, low income inequality, parents really don't bother that much with kids. And you have China to the right upper corner, high income inequality and parents very much involved with the kids. I can remember, Matthias, when I was growing up in India, the situation was, and I think I still believe it is the case, is very similar to what you might find in China. And it's not only kids growing up, but also and I guess we'll talk a little bit about it, the options or the choices those kids have when they grow up. So the education itself seems to be sort of designed in a very prescriptive fashion too. I don't know if that is something that you looked at. But going back to this correlation between income inequality and parents' involvement, can we really draw any causality from it? What is your feel?
Yes, that is the big question. We were drawn to this hypothesis that inequality matters to some extent, just based on the observation that we know that in countries like the United States, inequality grew tremendously over the last few decades. But it also rhymes with, again, personal experience, where you realize as a parent today in the United States that a lot of the stress that you're under comes from this great desire to have well-educated children. And why do you really want your children to do well in education? Well, because parents know that it matters tremendously for outcomes. Parents know that if you complete a college education, that you have a very good prospect to make a secure income and be well off, have a safe path into the middle class. If you do not finish college nowadays, that path is no longer as secure. There's a very large gap in outcomes depending on how well you do in education, which is one aspect of inequality, which is driving this long-run trend. So I think speaking to parents today, it is quite clear that plays a big role in their thinking. And again, thinking back to what we experienced earlier, when I was little, inequality was very low in Germany. It didn't matter that much if you go to university or start an apprenticeship at a small company or an industrial plant. And so I think parents didn't perceive that same pressure.
Yeah, so the more uncertain the outcomes are, proxied here by, let's say, income inequality, there appears to be more involvement of the parents on the premise that their involvement actually, I guess they don't believe it reduces uncertainty because it's a property of the system, but rather it reduces the probabilities of bad outcomes for the kids.
Exactly.
Is that what they're believing?
Exactly. You think that you're able to push your kid a bit more and make them end up a little higher on the ranking, that social ranking. And if inequality is high, then that is something that weighs relatively more on your mind compared to other things like having your child having just a relaxed and happy time. And now, of course, it's just a hypothesis. You asked before about the data. So to get some sense if this is causal, we have to look a little bit deeper. Ideally, you would like to do a controlled experiment, but we can't really do this with parents and children. We can't really, force parents to not spend much time with their kids or be very authoritarian. But we can look at variation. And so one thing that is helpful is what you mentioned, this cross-country variation, where you see that in the United States today. And so we use data from this survey. It's called the World Value Survey, which is quite nice because it captures many countries and asks people about attitudes in many different directions. And this question we are using comes from a set of questions about what values are important to emphasize in raising children. And as you mentioned, in the United States, about 2/3 of parents say that working hard is an important value for kids. And if I talk to parents I know, they would all agree, that the kids should apply themselves and work hard in school. But then you go to Sweden, and there's only 11%. There, in fact, most parents think that pushing your kid hard, like we do here in the United States, is a bad idea. They think it's bad for kids. They should just be free and play outside. My co-author lived in Sweden, and so he has many colorful stories to tell about this. And,
yeah. No. So I'm always interested when I see a chart that has Sweden, Norway, Finland on one side of it, and United States, Russia, and China on the other side, and it sort of makes intuitive sense. But the question remains in my mind, Matthias, and see if you can think about this. So we know that the inequality is lower in Scandinavia. We know the inequality is higher in the US, China countries. But is it because, in other words, it's a chicken and egg problem? Did the parenting style created inequality, or the inequality driving the parenting style? That's the part that I have difficulty.
And you're completely right. One should always be suspicious of a chart with Scandinavia on one side and China or Asia on the other side, because there are cultural differences too. And we're not denying that those also matter. It's a question of relative magnitude. And what is the evidence that there's at least some causal impact from the inequality to parenting? Well, first of all, we point out the changes over time that you can see. In the United States, we had much more relaxed parents in the past. Even in Sweden, parents used to be very authoritarian a couple of generations ago. If you talk to older Swedish people, they had a very different memory of their childhood. But we can also do this more formally. So one empirical analysis we do is to look at this data, but we look at changes within countries over time as opposed to just variation across countries. And then you see very clearly that within a given country, so not comparing countries, but if inequality goes up within a given country, parents become more intense. For example, more parents report that hard work is important. In countries, there's just a few examples of that. In countries that have a lowered inequality, it goes the other way around. For example, Spain had a decline in inequality over the last few decades, and there, in fact, parents have gotten somewhat more permissive. So this is a stronger piece of evidence because it doesn't really rely on changes, on variation across very different cultures.
Right. Yeah, I was also thinking that, again, if you think about Sweden, Norway, Finland, they have their education systems are much more advanced. They always come on top in most metrics. And that's not the case for the US and China, presumably. I don't know much about China, but sort of the education level of these cohorts are different, right? Aggregate education levels are quite different as well.
Right, they're different, although I would argue that if you compare the United States and say Sweden, the difference is less so in the level as opposed to the inequality within the education system. So if you look, for example, at PISA scores, which is this international study of student achievement in math and languages. So we know that in these achievement tests, the US is kind of in the middle of the pack. It's not terrible. It's not at the top. It's in the middle of the richer countries. Sweden, in fact, is quite similar. It's also in the middle of the pack. It's not really excelling at having the highest, say, math scores in the developed world. And that would be countries like South Korea, also Finland, by the way. But what Sweden does have is a very equitable education system, where the education you get is not very dependent on your social background, where there's broad access to universities. Public universities are essentially free, and they're also a fairly uniform quality. And that is quite different from here, where we have at the top track perhaps some of the best education you can get. If you go to an elite private school, if you go to one of these Ivy League colleges, you do get an amazing education in the United States, but that's for a small slice of the population. If you go to the bottom end, it's a quite different story. And so this inequality in educational opportunities is also one aspect of this inequality, of this bottleneck feature in a country like the United States that really raises the pressure in parenting decisions.
Yeah, so it's impossible to run this, as you said, run an experiment. Yeah, the ideal experiment would be to take two systems and you said the initial conditions of inequality and then look at behavior. Or you said behavior and look at inequality over time, but it's an experiment we cannot run. But I found the other chart in the paper very interesting as well. So here you're looking at, again, x-axis has income inequality and y-axis has parents praising imagination. And so it is not just, the first one we looked at is really parents praising hard work. Meaning the proxy there is really the amount of time that you're spending, I guess. And the second one is really about sort of the quality of parent involvement. And then there you see sort of a negative relationship between the two, right?
Yes, and that's a great observation. And it's very much in the economic way of thinking, because as economists, we think of trade-offs. If you do more of one thing, you have to do a little less of another. And I think this shows very clearly one of the trade-offs that you face. Imagination, having a kid that's creative and uses the mind in novel and interesting ways. I think most parents anywhere would think, well, that's in principle something that is desirable. But the question is, how high is it on your list of priorities to foster creativity and imagination as opposed to other things? And here, I think what's happening is that if you're in a system that really emphasizes performance, say tons of homework, high stakes tests. If you think of, we have the SATs in places like South Korea and China, it's even more intense because these university admission tests you have to do really determine a large part of your life. So if you're in that kind of system, then emphasizing just learning and getting the math done is the most important thing, and the other stuff falls a bit by the wayside. Whereas in a place like Sweden, as we say, this pressure to do well on the test is not the same. In fact, the tests come in very late in the educational system. And so there's a lot more room to emphasize other aspects that are also important, such as imagination. Also, independence is another one like that.
Yeah, I was also wondering, Matthias, is there any data that sort of looks at innovation per capita in these countries, right? So if this is not what you're exploring, but I found that sort of interesting to think about. Is there any positive correlation between quality of parent involvement, in this case, praising imagination of kids, getting them to really think more broadly? Do we see the outcomes of that behavior to be positively correlated with, with that in terms of some kind of innovation per capita?
I think it's a super interesting question. I don't know if we have the data to really examine this, robustly right now, but I do think it's an important possibility, because if you do emphasize as a parent, there's only one way. The only way to success is do the math, go to college, finish up. That closes off a certain other path. It doesn't give you the same room to be creative. And we do see that many entrepreneurs, many successful founders of businesses actually were dropouts in high school or college. They did their own thing, followed their own dream. In a place like Sweden,
Right.
there's a lot of emphasis on working with others, on cooperating, which can also be an important part of innovation. At a superficial level, there's
Yeah.
some evidence. So Sweden, for example, does not do great at math scores. They do, in fact, very well in terms of innovation. So if you think of the tech sector in Europe, Stockholm is a bit like Silicon Valley, even though it's a small country. They're doing much better than bigger countries in Europe. And so it is certainly suggestive of that link, but it would take a bit more to get really hard evidence on that link.
Yeah, I don't know if this is right, Matthias. So there is some relationship here potentially to inequality in the sense that, so suppose I sort of create a per capita innovation curve of some sort, right? So in the US, if I look at it cross-sectionally, there is a very small group of people, let's say, I'm just hypothesizing, a very small group of people who show very high innovation, or very small group of universities, as you say, communities, etc. Silicon Valley, for example, show very high innovation. But we look at it cross-sectionally across the entire country, it's a totally different story. So the average is so much to the right of the mode, right? Is that what we see in the US?
Yes, I mean, it's always the case that entrepreneurship and founding businesses is a very small slice of the population. And so there's really no way to push a given child to become a successful entrepreneur. You can try to create conditions that makes entrepreneurship a bit more likely, but easier to achieve. And there we do see this varies quite a bit across countries. By the way, also across groups. So another observation is that immigrants are often quite successful in entrepreneurship. They seem to have maybe the right values and attitudes, maybe because they already have some entrepreneurship in making the decision to move to a new country that fosters that kind of decision making. But it varies a lot, and it would be certainly very valuable economically to learn more about exactly where that variation comes from.
Yeah, so if you look at Sweden again, where we find, if you look at Europe in general, you say that Sweden has higher levels of innovation. Do we find that Sweden is a small country? So do we find that sort of uniform across the country, or do we see that in pockets?
Well, it's locally very concentrated. It's just in big cities. Most innovation takes place in big cities. What I'm not quite sure, what I would assume is that a good number of the entrepreneurs were not born in Stockholm or Malmö, but moved there over time. But certainly having a place where this comes together is super important. That's one reason why Silicon Valley, even though the housing prices are off the chart, is still very relevant in today's world.
Right. Okay. And so what's sort of the primary conclusion? Not just conclusion, but observations that you have from the.
So the book makes this point more generally that we argue that you see a lot of variation in parenting behavior, quite even going much beyond what we just talked about now. Also going back in history when parents were very authoritarian, different parenting for boys and girls, gender differences. There's many aspects where parenting has changed tremendously over time. And the point of the book is to make this broad argument that a lot of this variation can be understood from the perspective of incentives provided by the environment. So what is the message? Is first of all nice to know that this works, that economics can speak to these issues. For us, it's also an issue about whether maybe there's something we should change, because many parents, I think many kids too, have the impression that maybe we have taken this intensity of parenting a bit too far. Maybe we are creating children that are anxious, and in fact, there's a very clear rise in anxiety, depression among teenagers and college students recently. But that maybe this is a bad development. But then our approach says, if you want to have a change, it is not about telling parents they should do something different, that they are doing it wrong. It is about changing the environment. It's about thinking about how institutions, how we organize the education system, for example, how these institutions feed back into what families do. Think about organization of schools in private and public, support for different levels of colleges, also how college admissions work. Last year we had this college admissions scandal, with some parents going to great lengths to cheat on admissions, which is, I think, just one more symptom of this bottleneck of getting to the top colleges really driving decisions in sometimes extreme ways. So it is really about changing the environment. And if you change the environment, then you can have a change. And that, I think, is an important thing to know if you look at some of these current outcomes and think they are problematic.
Yeah, so if I understand this correctly, Matthias, so is it rational behavior, meaning the return on that activity is high, activity, the kind of intensive parenting, so to speak. The return on the activity is high, it's a rational behavior, but the reason for that to happen is because of the high variance and outcomes, and the parent is really trying to push the kid to a better outcome. But do we have data to show that intensive parenting is a high return activity?
So we do see, well, again, as we said before, ideally you want experimental data. You can't really have that, but you can certainly see very clear associations between intensive parenting and measurable outcomes for children. So, for example, we see that the children of more intense parents are more likely to graduate from college. They're, in fact, much more likely to get higher education, like a PhD. They're also more likely to be upwardly socially mobile, so to be in a higher social class, a higher income bracket, for example, than their parents were. So in terms of these measurable economic outcomes, it does seem to work, which perhaps is not super surprising, because this is exactly what you're trying to do, to emphasize this path towards education and measurable success.
Okay. We'll take a quick break, Matthias, and when we come back, we talk about the role of women's employment in a pandemic.
Sounds great. Looking forward to it.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com. We are back. Matthias, I want to now get to some recent work. It's entitled, "This Time It's Different, The Role of Women's Employment in a Pandemic Recession," where you're looking at what is different, especially the one that we are going through now related to COVID-19. And you said typically recessions affect men more than women, but this one is different, right? So why is it different, and what can we learn from it?
Yes, so it's an important issue because this unequal impact of recessions on women versus men has arisen to be a large factor just in the recent 2-3 decades or so. So if you go back to the 50s, most families had a husband as a single earner, and so women did not play that much of a role in the labor force. But since then, we have this trend towards much more equal labor force participation of women and men. In fact, at the end of the previous year, at the end of 2019, for the first time, women were the majority of the labor force in the United States. But then in recessions, what has happened is that in recent recessions, men have in fact lost many more jobs than women have. And the main reason for that, among a couple of others, is that there's large differences in which sectors women and men work in and what kind of occupations they have. And so a typical recession usually hits sectors such as construction and manufacturing very hard, and those are sectors with very high employment shares. So many men get laid off there, whereas many women, for example, are in sectors such as government, education, more broadly the service sector, which is a bit less dependent on business cycle fluctuations. And so for this reason, in a downturn, usually many more men get laid off. And this gives you this phenomenon of a man recession in recent downturns. It was perhaps the most pronounced in the Great Recession of 2007-2009, the financial crisis and its aftermath.
And this is sort of a dual shock on women, right? Mm-hmm. So there is a job-related shock that you talked about, but also people with kids women are more involved with kids. And if you don't have the ability to send them to school or daycare and things like that, that's also going to create an issue, right?
Exactly. It's really both those factors combined. So the first part is just checking where do women and men work and how are they affected. And there the difference is that a pandemic recession is totally different because of the reason that people get laid off is that you can't work because of the pandemic. This is most pronounced in occupations that are what's called contact intensive, occupations that involve directly dealing with other people, perhaps customers, so where the infection risk is potentially high. Now, those occupations shut down the fastest. The classic example is restaurant business, where there's a lot of direct contact that you want to avoid, that you may have to avoid completely in a shutdown. And so just in terms of which workers were affected, it was more women than men initially, so more layoffs to women, because now the most affected sectors are those service sector occupations with very high female employment shares. But then we argue there's something on top of that, which is what you mentioned, is that you also have closures of schools and daycare centers. So all of a sudden, the need for providing childcare has gone up for parents throughout the economy. This is made even worse because informal childcare, such as childcare from grandparents, also becomes less available because social distancing means you probably want to keep some distance with older relatives to keep them safe. So now the question becomes, who is going to do all this childcare? And now we are to the topic of gender inequality, that even though it has gone down, the inequality has, nowadays women still do the vast majority of childcare. It starts with there being many more single moms and single dads, but also within couples raising children together, women do the majority of the work and therefore have been much more affected by this need for childcare and therefore a reduced availability to work.
Yeah, I'm looking at a chart, and just to give everybody a rough idea. And so the chart I'm looking at, the difference between the rise in women's and men's unemployment, U.S. recessions between 48 and 2020. And so this is a differential between men and women. And for most recessions, this is negative, meaning men lost more jobs than women for most recessions, with some minor exceptions, like in 1961. I wonder what happened then. But in 2020, we have a huge difference, about 2.9% difference. And so this is not something the country has experienced almost ever, right?
Has never experienced this direction of change, and also has never exchanged just such a big difference between the two genders in total. So this is we call it a she-cession, so a recession that affects women more. But the gap between women and men in absolute terms is a lot larger than all the man sessions before. So we never have had in the past a recession that has affected one gender so much more than the other.
Right. And you go through a model here, but without the details, Matthias. So from a policy perspective, how would you handle this? Clearly, we've been trying to get to an equal pay for men and women for a long time. We are nowhere close to that. So that is sort of designed into the system. And now we observe this phenomenon. Can we actually, potentially change unemployment benefits or other policy interventions that make it less of a problem?
That's right. Of course, you can't just remove the pandemic, so you have to deal with the consequences one way or the other. But there is many options for policies on the menu, and in fact, you see a lot of variation across countries in what they do, and correspondingly very different outcomes. So it starts with support. You mentioned unemployment insurance. One somewhat obvious thing to do there is to realize that a lot of unemployment or non-employment today is because of childcare. And so one thing you want to do is to make it possible to draw unemployment compensation, even though you're unable to work because of childcare. And to be clear why that's something new, usually being unemployed requires looking for work, being available to work. So if you're not really looking for work, you can't really draw unemployment compensation. Usually, this should be different now. This has been, in fact, one component of the CARES Act, which is now expired. But for some time, we did have that policy feature. Other countries had it too. But it is,
Go ahead.
So it doesn't stop there. So a second thing to do is to think about how to get women back into employment. Because at some point the crisis is over. We know from previous recessions that losing a job, really being out of work in a recession, has a very long-term consequences for your earnings ability. It's hard to find a job, but it's also even harder to find a job that has the same, say, career opportunities that you had previously. And so here, policies that preserve employment, that essentially subsidize employers to keep you on the payroll, at least formally, during the shutdown, so you can come back right after. They can be very successful in protecting those relationships. And again, they have been used just a little bit with the small business protection programs that the government had here, which have now expired. Other countries have been much more aggressive in essentially providing furlough pay so that unemployment wouldn't have to go up as much. And we do see that countries that have done that have seen a much smaller spike in unemployment than the United States. And the last plank, which is ultimately the most important one, is this issue of school closures. You know, of course, there's a health aspect, and we have to figure out, is it safe for schools to be open? But in terms of the economic repercussions, we see here this is, in fact, tremendously important because, first of all, for the overall economy, if you open schools, parents can work, so you free up labor supply. But it's also very essential for the gender inequality aspect. So if you were able to open schools at that moment, the gender inequality between women and men during this recession would just be much smaller. And of course, we're not advocating to just open schools without any regard to health. That would be a bad idea, but it informs the trade-off. So if, as policymaker, you think about, should I prioritize opening bars and restaurants, or should I prioritize opening schools? Now, that's a decision you can make. These are two alternative paths. And in the United States, we have essentially chosen to go first to bars and restaurants, which are still open, around here, whereas schools are mostly closed. Other countries have made the opposite choice, and we argue it's ultimately better for the economy. It's certainly much better for the future of gender inequality.
Right. Yeah, I mean, so this is sort of symptomatic, at least in my mind, or sort of a counting problem in the sense that what a woman does is not just the work, but she is more involved in the family, childcare, and things that we actually don't count in the GDP. And so when we think about, when there is a shock and trying to fix it, we are borrowing metrics that doesn't really have the big picture of what actually goes on. And so if we try to reduce the impact, we cannot just look at the job. It sounds to me, at least, we have to look at the family and what the net effect is going to be.
Right, for sure. And it's to some extent a measurement problem that we don't really take those other very important things into account. And even just to say, women are not working, of course, is really the wrong terminology to use because, the things you do at home as a parent, of course, it's a lot of work, and somehow we just have decided to use the work for doing things in the market. But we do know that, of course, there's variation across families, but we do know that on average, nowadays, mothers and fathers, women and men have similar aspirations. If they start out, nowadays, anybody almost independently of gender aspires to having an own career, independent income, and also to have a family. It just turns out that it's much easier to combine those things for men right now than for women because these leftover forms of gender inequality are still quite powerful. And so you have to worry that some of this progress that has been made in recent decades is lost in this crisis.
Yeah, so that's also an important thing to consider, right? So there is a systemic shock, and when we come out of this, we are not going to come out at the point where we started. We're going to come out somewhere completely different.
That's right. Exactly.
And so, yeah, so it's not just taking care of the shock. It's really the aftershocks that need to be really thought through from a policy perspective.
And we try to disentangle the different dimensions of that. And the most important one is the one we mentioned, is that if you drop out of the labor force in a recession, you're going to have a harder time getting back to the same spot. And this is something that tends to reinforce itself over time within families. So if you think of a family that has maybe a couple of kids, they were both working full-time, maybe with a similar pay before the recession. But now think of a couple where now during the recession, the mom is the one who steps back and is at home with the kids to do the homeschooling and the childcare. Now, so if the next time this couple has to make a decision, should we move to a new city, for example, because it's a better job for him versus for her, all of a sudden his income is going to count for more because he now has become the primary earner. So there's a quite important possibility that this becomes self-reinforcing, that once you fall behind, get more inequality, it leads to more specialization in the household. So men doing more market work, women doing more tasks at home. That makes this a really persistent shock, even if the crisis is over. Now, against that, I do want to say that there's some other forces too. Maybe one of the most important one is work flexibility. So another thing that has happened is that now we've all learned to work from home. Be in the basement and do our work on Zoom. And that is actually something that's ultimately quite beneficial for families, because having little kids in particular requires flexibility, requires being able to be home if a kid has a fever, to leave a bit early if they have to go to the doctor or be picked up for recital. And so it's already clear now that flexibility will stay with us afterwards. Many companies have announced they will make work from home possible, some even for everybody, even after the crisis is over. And so this increase in work flexibility will benefit families. And given that women have now the majority of that burden, it will benefit them relatively more. So there's other forces too, but they will take some time to really take over.
Yeah, and that flexibility, a lot of different dimensions to that flexibility too, right? So if you lost a job in Detroit pre-COVID, you looked to move, let's say, to Chicago. Now there is an opportunity to do exactly that, but without moving, because both the employer and the employee, like you say, are used to doing that. So, do you see, sort of the macroeconomic perspective, this flexibility will have a measurable positive effect
for sure.
on the economy?
And as you say, these so this issue, do I have to move to somewhere else is important, but it's a particularly big deal for couples. If you think of couples who both have careers, often if one of them takes a new opportunity, it means the other one has to step back. You currently both have two jobs, say in Detroit. If you move to Chicago because that's a great opportunity for him, then often the spouse will not quite have the same opportunity. So the moving towards jobs creates more inequality. To some extent, also wastes some human capital, because now the spouse will not be matched with as ideal a position as before. And if you can remove some of these frictions by doing work from home, and it doesn't matter where we are, that means both can be well matched, and this force of inequality will be somewhat less powerful. So there's really some hopeful stuff also coming out of this change in how we organize our work.
And I want to finish up with another paper that you have on a totally different topic. It's entitled, "Why Didn't the College Premium Rise Everywhere? Employment Protection and On-the-Job Investment in Skills." And you say, why has a college wage premium risen rapidly in the United States since the 1980s, but not in European economies such as Germany? And so basically, the college premium here is your ability to get a higher paying job. That differential between what you get without a college education and with a college education, that differential has risen rapidly in the US, but not in Europe. So what do you find there?
So yes, and I should say, even though it's a different topic, it does relate to what we talked about at the beginning, namely these changing inequality trends that also drive parenting choice. And we think of this as one part of the institutional background that goes into this. We see this differential trend that the college graduates in the United States are doing very well relative to everybody else. In Germany, it's a lot more equal across the education scale. And a lot of the literature in economics on this is really about what is special about college. So the typical story about why the college premium is high have to do with this idea, for example, there's new technology such as computers, the internet, and this notion that people with more education are just better at adopting to these new technologies. So it's really about something being different about what college education means for your productivity. But what we argue is that this doesn't really work so well because computers have spread in Europe too. They've spread in Germany, yet you don't see the same trend. And so what we try to point attention to is the skills not of the college graduates, but the skills of those that do not go to college. And here our notion is that in a country like Germany, there's a system that ends up providing quite advanced skills also to people who go to a more vocational training route and work for companies often for many years at the same employer. Whereas the same setup of having jobs that don't require college education, but that still provide skills and let you accumulate experience, that these jobs have become less plentiful in the United States and therefore have in fact reduced the opportunities for people without college education.
So employment protection in this context is the inability of an employer to terminate
That's
employment,
right. Mm-hmm.
or that the cause of termination is too high.
Exactly, and it's always a trade-off, because if you make it impossible to fire people, you're not going to have firms create any jobs. For example, India is an example of that, where you have very high employment protection, but then you get very little formal employment because employers are hesitant to create those jobs. But generally speaking, you have very little employment protection in the United States. And then we argue, well, what this means for your relationship to your employer depends a bit how stable the economic environment is overall. So if you're in a fairly stable environment where companies can plan for decades ahead, it doesn't really matter that much because there's still an expectation to have a long-term relationship. So what you should have in mind is think of, say, a high school graduate who starts working for, say, GM or AT&T or IBM in the 60s. So it's a job without employment protection, but it's still a job where you probably expect to be with this company for many years. And therefore, there's a lot of incentive for both sides to invest in that relationship. For the worker to really accumulate skills you need for this job. Also for the companies to create the kind of jobs, to create work conditions that reward accumulation of skill. And so you get a workforce that has a lot of firm-specific experience, is productive, and therefore warrants a higher salary.
But is there a difference in employment protection for variety of employees? The low-skill employees opposed to high-skill employees.
So that's something that varies across countries. In the United States, generally there's almost no formal protection. You can get a contract that's long-term, but by law you can be fired at any time. In Germany, other countries, again, there's a variety of different rules, but there are rules in place, for example, seniority rules that make it difficult to fire people, especially if they have been at a given employer for a longer period of time. So in practice, as a long-term employee in Germany, you have a lot of employment security, of course, unless your firm goes under, and then well, that's a different story.
Right. Are the wages approximately the same between the US and Germany for different types of employees?
So they have diverged a bit, So the big observation in the United States is that even though wage growth on average has been reasonably strong in recent decades, there has been almost no real wage growth for workers below median income. So if you look at the bottom half of US workers, depending on how you account for inflation, there's either no or very little progress in real purchasing power. And that at face value is quite surprising because productivity has been going up. So you wonder, well, why aren't they getting paid more? The answer that we are giving is that the composition of jobs has shifted. That in the 60s and 70s, there were still more jobs that were career jobs, not really for college-educated workers, for high school educated workers, but still long-term careers at a given employer with a high premium at the end of their employment. Whereas nowadays, there's more short-term employment and often employment that requires very little skills. If you work for McDonald's or in many service sector jobs, you have jobs where you can learn the job in 1 or 2 days, and that's as much as there is to learn. There is really no long-term accumulation of experience and skills. And so we argue that this change in the composition of jobs towards jobs that require less skills and therefore pay less is a reaction to some extent to change the economic environment, but the combination of that with a different regime for employment protection.
But I also wondered, I don't know if this is the case, but just for argument's sake, if the U.S. is applying technology at a higher level, let's say, technologies like robotics and artificial intelligence, you will see a sharp increase in college premium because the lower part of that spectrum is either going to be not having jobs or their power of wages eroding. So could we explain this by just sort of the application of technology difference?
Yeah, so that certainly can be a factor. Now, if one country becomes a lot more high tech more than the other, that would play a role. Of course, also the relative supply of grades also plays a role. So we're not denying that this might be one of the forces that is there, but we at the same time argue that if you look at high tech, in fact, a place like Germany is really not that different. There's a lot of automation, a lot of technology, a lot of robotics also used in Germany. And these stories do not explain why it is that the wages of below median workers in the United States have stagnated. So there's really no reason to expect, even if the high-tech workers do more, that the less educated workers wouldn't at least be getting wages growing at the rate of overall productivity growth. So it really does suggest there's some erosion of skill accumulation that was there before, and our paper tries to provide one possible explanation for that.
Okay, and so the sort of the overarching observation here is that employment protection has a big impact on inequality trends.
And I want to be very clear that we are not understanding this or pushing this as a clear endorsement of employment protection, because there's a long literature and it's very clear that excessive employment protection can be very harmful. If you make it too hard to fire people, there will be a little less hiring, and you see the ill effects in many countries. For example, there's places like Spain and France where youth unemployment is extremely high. Young people have a very hard time finding jobs to some extent because there's an overregulation. So there's definitely a trade-off. But we are making the argument that it's not all a bad idea, that there can be some useful interaction of a moderate level of protection and a better environment for the accumulation of skills for workers.
Yeah, so that's a complex optimization problem, right? So the more employment protection there is in a country, the less attractive, relatively speaking, to get to higher skills, higher education, because the premium doesn't rise as fast. And hence, the long-term effects of employment protection could be lower per capita higher education, I should say.
You could have somewhat less education. In fact, if you look at the difference, the US, Germany again, you do find that Germany does have fewer college graduates. So that's consistent with what you're proposing. But I think what you have to look at is at the inefficiencies. And when you propose policies, as an economist, you're looking for, is there something inefficient? Is there some externality that is going on? And we are arguing that there is some inefficiencies in contracting. It's difficult to write, really a complete long-term contract between workers and firms, and that a moderate level of protection can get you around some of those inefficiencies and therefore get you closer to the best conditions you could have for accumulation of skills.
Are there sort of simpler policies a country could consider to sort of get to not precisely to the optimum level, but closer to it?
No, so I think you can also ask the question, is there something we can do with more formal education? So in the United States, we have schools, we have high schools, we provide a lot of education in colleges. Compared to other countries, we do relatively less for people who want to go on, but not necessarily to college. So I'm thinking about things like vocational training, like apprenticeships, which are very characteristic of the German system. Nowadays, we have an environment where in the United States, about 60% of each cohort do not graduate from college. The majority do not get a college degree. But we do not really have a very clear system that says, well, how are we going to provide skills to this population? We are very focused on college, not so much on the other part. And so I think policies that provide more paths towards vocational training, ideally involving the business sector, involving apprenticeships, for example, I think it's a big missing part, and that would be a good place to start for counteracting some of these trends.
Yeah, so I want to just finish up with a question that's not in the paper. So do you think a system like Germany, where you have apprenticeship as an alternative, do you think such a system is more resilient in a shock?
Yes, I do think so, because it is about relationships. It keeps relationships between the business sector and workers intact. These apprenticeships provide skills. They are not really very highly paid, so it's a relatively low cost way for businesses to get connected to workers, to help them accumulate skills and have a workforce to draw on later on. And I think in downturns it is quite successful. We see this also when we compare across European countries, that youth unemployment in Germany is just a lot less reactive to the business cycle, say, compared to France or Spain or Italy.
Okay. Excellent. Yeah, this has been great, Matthias. Thanks so much for spending
time with me.
Thanks for having me on.
This was a lot of fun.
And good luck with this research. Thank you. This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.